Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast. We have two basic issues we're going to talk about today. One is, we're normally we record the podcast slightly after noon on Wednesdays, and right now it is a little after 5 o'clock, and we delayed it a bit because Kate was covering these oral arguments today where what seems to be the case that will overturn Roe v. Wade was argued before the Supreme Court. And I think many people realized when Amy Coney Barrett was placed on the court that was it for Roe v. Wade. Some people, held out some hopes or something. I think those hopes were fairly naive. But in today's oral arguments, she and Brett Kavanaugh seem to clarify for anybody who need clarifying what's going to happen. You know, they're on the court, they're young, they have lifetime appointments. They don't have to do little workarounds about they're not going to speak, not going to comment on a case that might come before me on the court and all that mumbo jumbo. They're going to do it, and Kate was covering and watching those hearings for us today, listening, and so we're gonna dig into what happened and why. I think it's sort of the universal impression that people have that if there was any lingering doubt that maybe Justice Roberts was going to put together a coalition for reductions or limitations on abortion rights, maybe one that would be one of these like 15-week ones where it's you know radically limited, but at least in theory there is still a legal right to obtain an abortion. That seemed to have gotten be put to rest. We're also going to talk about the other big story of the week, kind of a bit of a bummer, this Omicron variant, and the whole world trying to get a handle on what is going on with this thing. I think that there is probably more uncertainty than maybe the news reports that you have heard make out. I'm not trying to kind of be Pollyannish about it. It's potentially a pretty big reverse in the United States efforts, the globe's efforts to put COVID behind us. But there's a lot of things we don't know. So we're going to talk about both of those. Before we do that, I want to remind you that Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee is the sponsor of the Josh Marshall podcast. Do you like to start your day with a healthy blend of coffee and doom scrolling? Then you need coffee that gives you enough energy to fend off a wild horde of feral dweebs or whatever obstacles you face. A Grady's cold brew kit makes it easy to brew up a super strong coffee concentrate. Of course, if you wake up feeling a little less ready to battle your enemies, you can always add an extra splash of water or milk or to tame the caffeine. With Grady's, every batch you brew has infinite possibilities. Ready to discover your perfect brew? Get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Stumbling a little on my copy reading today. Sorry to the suits at Grady's because of that. But let's dig into this. So Kate, the sort of the universal uh, read that I have heard that I saw from your report at TPM is that if people expected it to be bad, and it was significantly worse than what people expected.
Yep.
So let's start with an overview. What, what happened?
Yeah. So, just to remind readers, this case is on a 15-week abortion ban out of Mississippi. It's been a bit less attention grabby than the Texas one that everyone's heard of by this point because, the Texas ban had that weird enforcement scheme to try to evade judicial review and make it impossible for someone to just sue the whole state and kind of preemptively uh, preemptively knock the law down. This is a more straightforward 15-week ban, but in the filings, the state just flat out encourages the justices to use this opportunity to overturn the abortion precedent, which is Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood. So, experts have long kind of warned that this is the bigger risk than the Texas case. If the conservatives want to go right at Roe, this is the case that they'll use. So, in my preparation for the oral arguments, I talked to a kind of a lot of experts, read all the briefs, and the reason that people were taken aback by these arguments is because they thought, if for nothing else than political purposes, the conservatives would see reason to couch their questions in, a respect for precedent, or to kind of tiptoe around the idea, or maybe to focus more specifically on the viability line, which is basically, the point at which a fetus can survive outside the womb, which is around 24 weeks. Some people expected them to question the science and then to maybe debate moving up the viability line to 15 weeks where this ban was. But besides John Roberts, who was kind of spending a lot of his time on a hypothetical 15-week ban, the other conservatives just didn't even pretend to address the Mississippi ban. I mean, almost all of their comments, all of the thrust was poking holes in those foundational abortion cases, questioning the constitutional grounding of the right to an abortion, um, you know, the historical precedent, all this kind of stuff. They just went right at it. And I think the thought was they might be hesitant to do that because of the massive backlash it would spark if they did just overturn Roe outright. Plus, you don't really need to. I mean, you can keep
Right. So
abortion legal. Go ahead.
well, that's kind of what I wanted to address here and ask you about. So as you state that the Texas law had what you might generously call a lot of legal novelties, sort of like you
Mhm.
can become like, abortion privateers basically, and, privately do these things with lawsuits and so forth, get bounties. But the Mississippi law is just sets a different timeline. Now it's what is it? It's you know, second trimester, and this pushes it back to 15 weeks. And so there's nothing, at least as I understand it, there's nothing odd or different about the law. It just sets a different time frame. And so the court could say, "Okay, yeah, I like your new law. That's great. And we're going to approve that." And that would just now 15 weeks. And obviously 15 weeks is a pretty drastic curtailment of, the timing framework. Did they get into why they would uh make a, or sort of appear to preview making a decision that the case doesn't require them to make at all? There's different sort of philosophies of jurisprudence here. You don't Why are they jumping to overturn Roe when even this case does not require that in any way?
I mean, the state is asking in their filings, they are asking them to overturn Roe and Casey outright, and if not, to get rid of the viability standard altogether, which, as you can imagine, would keep abortion legal in theory, but red states would basically race each other to see who can set the shortest abortion ban. You can terminate a pregnancy after 1 day or something like that.
Right, 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 right.
Um, but I think I think just the thing that's shocking is kind of the sheer opportunism. Like the bulk of the conservatives on the court just were not being coy about it. We're not really keeping their cards close to the vest. I'd say with the exception of Gorsuch was a bit more understated. Uh Barrett, maybe you could argue, but I mean the other three, in particular, Alito, Thomas, and Kavanaugh, were just pretty blatant. I mean, Kavanaugh kind of went off on these two different little monologues where he just kind of spitballed about, well, we're supposed to be neutral. The Constitution is silent on abortion. Why not just outsource this to the states? Let us be neutral again. on this question, as if not protecting a constitutional right is somehow neutrality.
Right, right. Did I guess I'm curious at some level why that surprised people. Maybe I mean, uh, this is the big one. This is the big thing. This is the, there's the whole conservative judicial legal movement that has been a thing in this country for 40 years or so, Federalist Society, all that kind of stuff. Those folks have a lot of different fish to fry legally in this country. Abortion is not the only thing they're interested in. In many ways, a lot of the sort of the, kind of smarty pants conservative law professor types, or other issues that they're most interested in. But it's abortion that provided the engine and the motive power to take the Federalist Society conservative legal movement and change it from, like, just a kind of a student group at law schools to something that now dominates the whole federal judiciary, and that's abortion. So now that they have not just the votes, they have more than enough votes. I mean, sort of, it's kind of, you have that Roberts issue where he's always wanting to kind of hold back a little for a whole series of possible reasons, but they have 6 votes. So why would they be coy?
I think because it would be more in keeping with how a lot of the abortion battles have been fought, particularly on the state level. When you look at trap laws in particular, which have to do with kind of heaping silly restrictions on abortion providers that make it impossible for them to function, things like hallway width, countertop level, things like that.
Right.
They were so weedy and boring and complicated that no one paid attention to them and no one really mustered up any fight against them. And that combined with the fact that pro-choice groups, especially on the state level, have been just completely underfunded for years, but that let a lot of this stuff go through. And I think the thinking was somewhat similar here, that if they went at Roe in a weedy, hard to follow, hard to capture in a scary headline way, they wouldn't have to reckon with the backlash that will happen when headlines read Supreme Court overturns Roe. So then, you kill both birds with one stone. You basically make abortions almost impossible to get. And then you
Right.
don't have to worry about, your buddies in the Republican Party perhaps having their midterms endangered or just funneling this wave of political activism towards Democrats.
Right. Right. That all makes sense. I guess my and I'm not sure this is right, what I'm going to say. I guess just intuitively, seems to me that unless and until you had a strong anti-abortion rights majority on the court, there was always an interest in y- you know sort of, there's this thing, Zeno's paradox. If there's if I'm not telling you this, but just for our listeners, if the distance between you and a line, if you keep going halfway to the line, you know if it's 4 feet, at 2 feet, then 1 feet, blah blah blah, you will never arrive.
Hmm.
you know and it's the there's been a reason why they want a kind of a Zeno's paradox approach to Roe, because, as you say, you never get the scary headlines. It's just kind of happening in a in a in a cryptic kind of way, that it's just harder and harder to do, even though there's still abortion rights, still Roe, still Casey, all this kind of stuff. But it just seems to me now they have 6 seats and they know they have 5 seats, right? They don't have to. They don't even have to worry about John Roberts nonsense anymore. So why hold back? I mean, I'm not saying I'm right. That's just my kind of. It seems to me that way. I mean, and for whatever reason, they seem they seem not to be holding back.
I mean, I guess there are factors, right, that might encourage them to feel that way. As we've talked a lot about on this podcast, we're reaching a point where, the kind of structural advantages to the Republican Party are so great that maybe they're not concerned about, a hyped up Democratic base. I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny because on the one hand, these people are. the people who make up this majority are deeply partisan, deeply political. Um, but they've got their own judicial ambitions,
Mhm.
and they're not necessarily that worried about the short-term prospects of the Republican Party. I think they worry about it a lot, but I think their worry about the electoral prospects of the Republican Party can at least take a bit of a backseat to a prize this big,
Yeah.
right? And there's I think I believe the oldest member of the court at this point is Clarence Thomas, I
Mhm.
believe. I think he's about 70. Um, as Supreme Court justices go, that's midlife basically. So, all sorts of things could happen and they're still going to have 6 votes. So kind of who cares? Did you get just from uh obviously not from the hearing itself, but just, seeing the public reaction to that hearing from just, kind of random anybody's to high-ranking elected officials. How characterize the response? What has the reaction been?
Yeah, I mean, I spent my day on the Hill on Tuesday kind of preemptively asking, particularly the female Democratic senators about this and kind of confirming for myself and our readers that there is no viable path to passing any kind of legislation to preempt what the Supreme Court might do. Um, if you haven't read my piece, there is not such a path. I mean, obviously, our listeners know there is the filibuster. You're never ever going to get 10 Republicans to vote for abortion safeguards. And then within the Democratic Party, there's not even unification. I mean, Joe Manchin and Bob Casey both call themselves pro life and have not signed off on a Senate version of a House bill that passed in September that would codify Roe v. Wade. So, in that way, I think a lot of the reaction has kind of mirrored what the lawmakers told me on Tuesday, which was, yeah, we're super worried about it. We think it's going to be really bad and not a ton you can do about it right now.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I think Tammy Duckworth gave me the most candid answer where she said, we need to pass legislation and we can't do that in a 50-50 Senate. So that makes the 2022 midterms much more important, which actually it does bring up something I wanted to talk to you about, which is that I don't know if you saw the Senate Democrats Twitter account tweeted elect more Democrats to safeguard abortion rights, and people got really mad about it. Like there was a significant backlash to that. And I get it. I think the backlash is rooted in the fact that there's like so little compassion in that tweet. It's such a how can we best use this to our political advantage kind of whiff to it.
Yeah, I guess.
And
Yeah.
I think it's also just a bit I don't know. I think the frustration is coming from people being like, we did all this work to elect all these Democrats and it's frustrating to see nothing get done, even though, it's back to the issue of the
Yeah.
50-50 Senate, which
y-
which we've discussed.
Yeah, I mean it's a tough one because we have a tied Senate. Basically, no one has ever passed any major legislation with a tied Senate. It just doesn't happen. And uh, it's this weird dynamic now where you know Democrats have unified power in Washington by the thinnest margins imaginable. What is it? A 3-seat majority in the House,
Mhm.
a no seat majority in the Senate, uh, a a a a a senior citizen president whose poll numbers are currently underwater. Um, that is just really hard to do a lot in that setting. Um, and the other thing, it's funny, you have this very toxic dynamic where the expectations are higher than they have ever been, and for good
Mhm.
reason. But the power to do stuff is about as thin as it could possibly be. One of the things that, a lot of people say how, democracy itself is on the ballot in 2022. And in real ways it is. But what that means is that not only do Democrats need to, pass a kind of a New Deal quantity of legislation with their 50-seat majority in the Senate, they also can never lose another election,
Mhm.
because if they lose an election, then democracy will be over. And I'm not making fun of that argument. There's some real truth to that argument, but you get a sense of, wow, these are some pretty high expectations. You need to pass a New Deal scale of legislation with a tie Senate, and you can't ever lose an election. That's tough. That's a hard standard.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple thoughts on this. The first of which is reactions that way, that's like, "What have you done for me lately? Why should I vote for you again?" seems to me to be a mindset that maybe predates January 6th, predates the Republican Party becoming such an active threat to democracy, because I just think the old kind of pendulum swings don't apply as cleanly as they used to, because it's on the in the worst case scenario, right? You have one party that people find to be very ineffectual and weak, and then you have a party on the other hand where its members like cheer stealing elections. So there is a fundamental mismatch there.
Yeah.
And I also think the "what have you done for me lately" thing, it is a little bit of the recency bias where, they passed this huge relief bill when they first got in. They passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. They are, even though, trust me, no one feels it more agonizingly than me, they're on the heels of passing the reconciliation bill. I mean, what would people claim as wins under the Trump administration? You pretty much had those tax cuts in 2017 and a couple COVID relief packages. And, that's kind of the long and the short of it. So I get people's frustrations. I think they should pretty much all be channeled towards Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, and kind of to pull back on this desire to just say, this is all the Democrats' fault. The Democrats won't get this done. It's like, actually, if you got rid of the filibuster, you would find that you had 48 people lined up to do pretty much everything that Democratic constituents want to get done. There really are just a couple people who are kind of creating this situation.
I think, yeah, I mean, another issue in this conversation, and I mean the broader conversation, the one that you and I are engaging in now, but that we have seen, more than usual in 2021, is, who are the Democrats? I did a post I don't know, a few weeks ago, a few months ago, something like this, and as a sort of a parenthetical in this conversation, in this debate, I said, you know, a lot of the die was cast when Democratic voters did not manage to, bring home victories in North Carolina, in Maine, in a bunch of states that seemed winnable, right? And it didn't happen. And I got a lot of pushback, like, "Oh, the voters let down Chuck Schumer. The voters failed the Democrats." There's some weird stuff in our society about collective responsibility. You know, who are the Democrats? It's really everybody who is in a broad political camp in this country. You can say Chuck Schumer sucks or Nancy Pelosi sucks or any number of people suck. But at the end of the day, this is a collective thing. We don't all have the equal amount of power, but it is the Democrats didn't get it done as much as, it's fantastic that they even got a majority, technical majority in the Senate. Um so but this also comes back to that, what have you done for me lately? Well, okay, where else are you going to go?
That's what I mean.
if you're kind of like you're really upset about saving democracy, and you're really upset about abortion, and you're really upset about immigration and dreamers, and these are all things to be really upset about. I'm upset about them. But okay, where else are you gonna go? You know, it's a collective thing, and um, again, tied senates, you don't. I heard a bark. Yeah, thank you so much, Rufus. All right, give me a second. Let me try to resolve this. Where are you gonna go? And to your point about the sort of you know coldness, or I guess sort of, reducing the moment to an electoral calculus. I get that. I mean, that is, maybe there's some not reading the room of the tonality there, but you know, if this is important, yeah, you got to elect more Democrats, because parties with significant majorities, certainly with actual majorities. Remember, the Democrats don't have a majority. They have 50 votes. They just have the vice president there who can knock them over over the edge. That is what you have to do. And people, I assume this is kind of these are back and forth you're talking about on Twitter, and Twitter's sort of a place where everybody sort of vents their either their ids or their you know crying 3-year-old in a fetal position, all of which we have all of these things, right? When you're just upset and you want to lash out at someone. But these are the realities. You got to elect more Democrats.
Yep.
That's just the fact. And you can the reality is the Democrats it's not the DNC, the secret cabal of the DNC. And it's not this person or that person. They have a lot more power. They should be accountable if things aren't going well. But at the end of the day, it is up to everyone who is, in our country, you are you're either a Democrat or a Republican, or you're someone who chooses not to call themselves a Democrat or Republican, but it has politics that are either more similar to the Democrats or more similar to the Republicans. This is just the reality we live in. So anyway, should we talk about Omicron now? As long
Let's
as
move on to
yeah,
plague and pestilence.
move
So,
on to a more fun topic. So yeah, I've been following, and let me tell everyone who I've mentioned this a few times on the site. Um, it's hard to get good information about anything tied to COVID. Uh, what you want, things that are reliable, you want knowledgeable. When you want really kind of detailed information, you want that. I've got this list on Twitter. Twitter has lists. You can curate lists. I have a list of about 50 or 60 epidemiologists, clinicians, science journalists, each one of whom, very knowledgeable, very trustworthy. If you go to, if you're interested in looking at it, I've linked it on the site. You can also just find me on Twitter, and then, the Twitter interface lists the lists that someone has. It's there. It's like, the epidemiologist list or something like that. So if you're interested in this, I would recommend that. That's a really good place. It's sort of striking to me. I mean, this has been, obviously, COVID has dominated the world for the last almost 2 years. And so it's not a surprise that everybody in every country in the world follows this really closely. With all that, though, it's still pretty striking that this variant, which only really became a global news story on Thanksgiving. So what, like, just under a week ago, it's totally upended and then re-ended, global equities markets. There's travel bans, pharmaceutical companies talking about, revising, it has been a massive, massive thing. Um, what's your sense? Is this a personal issue for you? Is it making you think like, "All right, am I gonna have to live my life different in the next year?" Or where are you on all this?
Full candor here. Over Thanksgiving, I decided, in the interest of my self care, I was not going to read about this variant because I could not take it. I've seen a bit more now, but I I don't know. I think, I've been kind of leading our coverage on Congress and the Supreme Court, and that's a bit weighty. So I've been like,
Right.
I'm gonna let the other people figure out the variant. So you have to tell me what fully is going on here.
Well, it's funny because and this is the personal level of it that, as many of our listeners know, well, you don't know my exact age. I'm 52. I have two teenage sons. They've both been they're both over 12. So they've been vaccinated for a while. And before, there was a period of time when my wife and I were vaccinated, but they weren't vaccinated. And like, I love my kids, but most kids do okay with COVID. So it's really like, do not bring your kid COVID into my house and give me COVID. I don't want to get COVID. When they got vaccinated, like, okay, that's an improvement. And you know, I'm fully vaccinated. I've had a booster. So I think, like many people in the United States, I have been able to move into this place, over the last several, almost year now, but several months in which, I could definitely get COVID. I'm not like, locked in a plastic bubble in my house. I go out, I mask, pretty cautious, but I have been able to have a pretty strong confidence that if I get COVID, it is not going to end my life. And it is very unlikely I'm going to end up in the hospital. I'll be on, and I could get long COVID and maybe lose my all bad sense of smell, all those things. But like the getting COVID, I have not experienced as an existential issue as it was for pretty much everybody, to different degrees, in 2020. And so it's one of those things like, wow, I don't want to go back to that.
Yep.
I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to be kind of like, if I'm in a supermarket with my mask and kind of like, if I get COVID, I could die. Like, I don't want, that's a whole different thing. So in any case, that's like, that's my subjective disquisition about my stuff that goes on inside my head. It's funny. The thing is, it's also, this has always been kind of the funny thing to me about COVID. It is both terrifying and has damaged all of our lives to a great degree. I mean, some people more than others, to put it mildly, but it has affected all of us to a great degree. Even those of us who are lucky enough to have never gotten it, have not had a close loved one who's had a bad experience with it, blah, 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 blah. It's affected all of us. Um, but it's also fascinating. The mRNA vaccines, all the stuff that the science of virology today. Back in 1918 with the Spanish flu, they didn't even know what a virus was. They didn't know the difference between bacteria and viruses. And now, they have these things where you can actually, they have maps of the things that, oh, this little part is moved. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, the different parts of the spike protein and everything. I think the key is we don't really know what we're dealing with. And it is possible, I want to stress this again. It is possible, based on what we know right now, that Omicron will be have spread advantages over other forms of COVID, but will be a less serious disease.
Hmm.
That's a good thing. Now, it might be a less serious disease, but it also has significant immune evasion. So that's a little more complicated, right? Like it may be a less dangerous disease, but your vaccine may not help you as much in avoiding getting it or fighting it. Um, there's also really bad scenarios where the vaccine loses a lot of its effectiveness, all tied to this issue of the spike protein. It's a very different spike now. It's got all, it's got basically all the mutations that all the other variants have, exaggerating a little there, but not much, and a bunch more. And maybe it's more lethal. Maybe it's more transmissible. You put all these things together and you get a really bad scenario. Um, it's probably some mix of the two. I mean, one of the most interesting people to me in this whole story is this guy Trevor Bedford, who has a research lab at this place in Washington State, and he's someone I started following at the very beginning of the epidemic pandemic. He was the one, if everybody remembers back to the very beginning, the one who figured out that the cases um, in Washington State, kind of figured out that it was spreading in Washington State by all this kind of, viral DNA analysis. In any case, one of the things he had a really good Twitter thread about this. That one of the basic questions is it more transmissible? Is it more contagious? That in many ways can be more important than whether it's more deadly, because it can be a bit more deadly, but if it's more transmissible, even something that is the same level of deadliness, if it's more transmissible, lots more people will get it, and so lots more people will die. So transmissibility is a key thing. It seems to be spreading quickly in South Africa and displacing Delta. So it seems to have an advantage over Delta. And that seems like, okay, it must be more transmissible. It must spread more easily. But it's not that simple. It might even be less transmissible. It might be less contagious. But in a country like South Africa, a big majority of the population is either vaccinated or they've had COVID. So it might be less transmissible, but people might have less immune protection from it. So there's all these different variables in play: immune evasion, transmissibility, inherent deadliness, right? How sick it makes the average person. And what they're going on now is just that there are way more mutations than any of the than the other variants have had. It seems to have transmissibility advantages over Delta, although that's not clear. And so the scenarios really range from not that big a deal to pretty bad. And we just kind of don't know yet, because these things take at least a couple weeks to really sort out. The one thing I will say is the one sort of, positive in all of this is that mRNA vaccines are fairly easy to update. And I have not seen anybody who thinks that Omicron is harder to make a vaccine against than Alpha, the original variant, Delta, whatever. It's just that you need to kind of bring it to market. And they can probably do that in 3 or 4 months. It's not a matter of waiting a year to get a new vaccine if it's kind of the worst case scenario. You can probably get it, and Pfizer says they can do it in 100 days. Now,
Yeah, but isn't that super unsustainable? It's like, what are we going to make a new vaccine for every variant and ask everyone to get it every time?
well, yes and no. We ask people to get a flu shot every year.
Yeah,
And that and
but
that is the same. It's the same thing. What, with the flu, these are different variants of the flu. The flu is constantly evolving. I think, I mean, I'm not saying that's great. I'm just saying it's better than waiting a year for another
yeah,
vaccine.
yeah,
And um yeah, if we are perpetually in the state where, every 6 months there's some new variant and we're kind of, back in COVID Groundhog Day, yeah, that will really suck.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, is there any reason to believe that we won't be in that state? I mean, that's where we've been so far, right?
well, I I think we don't know. I think a lot of things are possible. I think that if one one reason we're in the Omicron situation is that about half the world's population is not vaccinated.
Right.
And that means you have lots of, more than enough population to mutate endlessly.
Mhm.
Um, so, you know, one thing here is this is why you need sort of global vaccination. That is the clearest path to sort of, bring this to an end. Um, I think, one thing is that every scientist, clinician, epidemiologist who follows this, I think pretty much all of them have assumed that eventually there will be mutations that mean you need an updated vaccine. Most of them seem surprised that that this one with such dramatic differences popped up now. And there's a lot of questions like how did that happen exactly? And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, obviously there's it could just be bad luck. Humanity's bad luck. One of the interesting things I saw, and this was I want to emphasize, this was just raised as a legitimate possibility, not something that is proven. It's speculation, but from a very knowledgeable person. Most of the coverage of this has assumed that this variant originated by long-term infection of someone with immune compromise. So maybe someone with HIV AIDS or some other, basically it gets in someone's body and there's like a standoff. And that gives the virus a lot of time to kind of, to mutate and come up with better strategies, basically. Um, this person, and I don't remember the person's name, but again, this wasn't some random person. This was a very respected scientist in this field, said that he thought that was less likely and that what he thought was a real possibility is that this kind of dramatic jump that this variant of COVID made, and we know it's a dramatic. We don't know whether it is a dramatic jump that is relevant to us humans. We know that there's a lot of mutations, rapid level of mutations, more than we have seen in the other variants. That how this happened, or one possible way this may have happened, is that it went from human hosts to an animal host. That involves a lot of, a lot of mutations to adapt to another species. So human to animal, and then back from animal to human. Because one of the things when they're kind of doing all this detective work now about this variant is it seemed to pop up. It seems to have its lineage has a long history, but it seemed to pop up with a huge number of mutations kind of out of the blue. And so you know, how's that happen? Well, one potential way it happens is it took a detour into some other species for a while. In any case, it is a if the fate of humanity weren't on the line, it's a fascinating detective story, right? And there's a lot of amazing science to how they figure this stuff out. Alas, uh, humanity's fate is at stake, or at least potential suffering on a global scale. Um, but that's where it is, and that's we just have a lot of unknowns, and it really does seem to be uh, you know run the range from your vaccine will be, less effective against infection, but still pretty effective against, a bad outcome, getting hospitalized or dying, to, it our vaccines really may not work as well for a while until we get boosters, and so we could be in for a pretty tough winter in the northern hemisphere. So, should we do questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Our first question from Josh, who says he wanted to hear our analysis on the potential impact of various abortion rulings on the 2022 midterms. So, kind of connects with what we were talking about. Do you think Democrats will see some kind of huge surge if the court comes? Remember, this was only oral arguments today. So, if the court comes to a final ruling on this case before November 2022.
And I think the expectation is that this ruling would come out in like May, June, July,
Yep.
in the summer. So it's obviously the court can do anything at once, but they have a schedule they go by. So I think it is highly likely this will happen in the summer, a few
Right.
months in advance of the midterm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only reason there's question around that is because they took such an unusually long time to take up this case in the first place. It was reconferenced like a billion times, but
Right,
yeah,
right,
that is when it's expected to come out.
right. So what is your sense? What are your own thoughts? What did you pick up on the
Yeah.
Hill yesterday about that?
I think yeah, I mean, I think it'll pump up the base. I think it's probably an overall good thing for Democrats, kind of the same way that Republicans have pretty adeptly just turned elections into, do you want a Supreme Court seat? Then vote for our guy. Um, and I think Democrats are so deflated in general that having a fire under the collective constituency's ass is probably a good thing. But I don't know. My kind of pet theory is that 2022 is all going to come down to what COVID looks like at that time, if it's still kind of making everyone live half lives or not. And I'm not sure that it's all that much deeper than that. I think that we, on this pod and in the larger conversation, have spent so much time talking about why Biden's numbers went down, why they continue to go down, why the mood shift. I just really think it all comes down to COVID and people thinking that it was going to be taken care of by now. Um, and so I think in general, the court's ruling on Roe will probably drive out Democrats and particularly women who, as we've seen, have the potential to swing, you know, huge amounts of the election just by virtue of, where they live and where they come out. But I think there's going to be other factors at play. What do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah. There's no question. I mean, I think it potentially will be a very big deal, and
Yeah.
obviously, it is not an issue that like, oh, it would, kind of like the vote for the Iraq War in 2002. It's not like people are going to forget about it in
Mm-hmm.
2023, right? It's gonna be it will be a big issue forever, basically. Um, So I think it'll be a really big issue, but I also think you're right, and in a way that goes beyond any conversation about abortion rights. You know, of course it's about COVID. Of course it's about COVID. We have that old James Carville line. It's the economy, stupid. Economy's bad. Economy's good. When you have a really bad economy, the vast majority of people still have their job. They're still making the same amount of money. It changes everybody's mood, but most people are pretty much in the same situation they were when the economy was good, right? Or um y- you know CRT paranoia. Most things that we all understand are huge things politically. For the vast majority of people, those people are spectators. Right? Now, you're a spectator in a game, you might get, coach might send you in, right, to join the unemployment lines, but still, the effect on us. But COVID is different. Even if you're not in the hospital, man, it is totally like, I was coming up the elevator in my apartment building just today and had one of those moments where I thought, wow, it's weird that we're all standing here with masks. That's weird. That's really weird. I did not expect that. My whole life, I have not seen that. That is really weird. And there's 5 of us in a pretty small elevator, so maybe I'm gonna try to breathe a little less until we get to the ninth floor where just it is so it affects all of us so much. And that's let alone, like, if you're a healthcare worker who's been at this for almost 2 years and you're just at burnout and you know, you don't know if you can keep going anymore. I mean, my experience of COVID, relatively speaking, has been quite mild. I haven't gotten COVID. I am blessed to have a professional situation where I can just hang out at home and, when things get really bad, go into the plastic bubble in my apartment, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. But it affects everybody so much that of course it's all about COVID. And we should, you're 100% right. And we should just have that be um the basic assumption about everything going forward until this is done to whatever extent it gets done. Just a kind of a random nugget of information, got a reader email today from someone who just mentioned that this person had traveled to a state, kind of bluish purple state, very educated, affluent school district, and everybody at that school district is totally, you know, eh, not Republican crazies about masks. Everybody is on edge because I guess in that school district, they just don't have enough teachers. For whatever reason, they don't have enough staff to keep the schools open. And parents are kind of wondering each day, am I going to get a call that they had to cancel school today because they didn't have enough teachers and teachers' aides and stuff like this? I don't know what that's about. COVID relief bill set aside tons of money for schools. And I don't I don't know if that is about that district has had a retention problem, or is it that they have, lots of teachers are having to, kind of stay home for 2 weeks because they had some nominal exposure to COVID somewhere and I have no idea. But there are just all these ways where people's lives are still getting pressured and pressured hard, if not turned upside down because of COVID. And is it Biden's fault? I don't know. Again, I don't know what's going on in that one district. This is a big district somewhere in the middle of the country. Um, but man, he's in charge. So it's kind of all on Biden. And so I think you're right. It is if we are really doing well on COVID, I think the Democrats are in a world of a different situation. If it sucks, then it's really bad. Having said that though, I do think um abortion is one of those very few game-changing
Mhm.
issues. And I think the other thing is, we're kind of thinking in terms of federal politics. But I did a post this afternoon where I pointed out that I think a lot of people think, oh, well, it's going to suck in Texas. It's going to suck in Mississippi. It's going to suck in Idaho. But it could suck in Wisconsin or even Pennsylvania. Because the thing is, people, a lot of people saying now, oh, democracy's on the ballot in 2022. But the reality is that a lot of states, their state legislatures are so aggressively gerrymandered that basically Democrats aren't ever going to have control the state legislatures. Wisconsin is like a 50-50 state, right? Governors is always 51-49, president 51-49. But for the last decade in Wisconsin, it's Republicans have either had a majority or a super majority in the state legislature. So basically, Democrats are never going to control that. I mean, never has a short half life in politics, but as far as we can see out into the future, in 2020, Democrats barely prevented Republicans from getting a supermajority in the state legislature while Biden won. Right? So you have these cases you know, Evers loses in 2022. You've already got a permanent Republican legislature. Why won't they just ban abortion if there's no Roe? And frankly, Pennsylvania state legislature is kind of the same, right? Michigan's kind of the same. So, in addition to the federal stuff, I would imagine, I think the Wolf guy is term limited in Pennsylvania, but whoever's running there, or like with Evers, governor can say, like, if I don't win, there goes all abortion rights in this state. I think that's pretty powerful
Mhm.
in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, because I think there are a lot of, I mean, it gets beyond our ideological tendencies and our ideas about rights. I think there's a lot of people in those states who think like, oh, there might not, if you're a woman, I might not be able to get an abortion next year if this governor's race doesn't go right. I think that puts the fear of God into people politically. And obviously it's not just women, right? So I think it can be pretty potent at the state level too. So it's just a we know how huge it is as a reproductive rights issue. It's a huge issue electorally too. And I think we're gonna see it play out pretty soon.
There's also the old chestnut of, it's a lot harder to take away a right after people have gotten used to it. And we've had 50 years of people getting used to the fact that abortion is legal in the United States. And then to just rip the rug out under that and introduce the reality that abortion is only accessible at all if you live in a state under Democratic power. I mean, and not to look through rose colored glasses, Mississippi has exactly one abortion clinic right now.
Right.
These rights have been under assault for decades, but to have that clear bifurcation of, you live in a blue state, women have full access to health care. If you live in a red state, you don't. Yeah, I mean, that you're asking a lot of women to kind of be okay living in a place where a whole swath of healthcare is just unavailable. So, yeah, I agree. I still think that COVID is going to be a huge factor, but I do think it's going to be super potent, which again is why I was a bit surprised that they didn't couch the language more today, because I think the backlash is going to be something to behold.
Okay, so I think we agree. It will be a dramatic and game-changing event electorally, in addition to as a substantive issue of a huge amount of the population losing access to healthcare and reproductive rights. So we'll know more about this. Well, I guess we'll really know more about it in 6 or 7 months, but
Right.
we'll get more of a sense of the politics even by the next episode. So let me remind everybody, the Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. You can get 25% off at gradyscoldbrew.com with promo code TPM. And that's it.
All right.
Later.
Later. The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.